Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. This year marks 8 decades since the Korean Peninsula was split in two, an unresolved legacy of the Cold War that has only grown more complex. As tensions sharpened between the U.S. ROK-Japan alliance and the North Korea, China, Russia bloc, the region is now seen by many as the front line of a new Cold War. Now, recent displays of military solidarity among the three countries backing the North and the regime's accelerating weapons tests are raising new alarms. At the same time, Europe is stepping closer to Indo-Pacific security, and defense ties between South Korea and EU nations are expanding. So today, we examine what a 21st century strategy for unification and peace might look like and what the global community's role should be. And for that, we invite Dr. Eric Balbach, Korea Foundation Fellow at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, here in the studio with us. A big welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for joining us tonight. So let's start right away. So like I've said, this year marks 80 years since Korea's division, and the peninsula now really sits at the center of a new Cold War dynamic. Like I've said, U.S. ROK-Japan, and on the other side, North Korea, China, and Russia, of course. So Dr. Balbach, at this point in time, what do you see as the core strategic challenges for Korea's unification and national security?
You know, the closer relations between China, North Korea, and Russia certainly are a consequential shift, strategic shift in Northeast Asia, what we're currently seeing. What we didn't so far see is true trilateral coordination between the three countries. And we know that because North Korea too usually prefers bilateral approach to its counterparts. And to that end, what we saw last week was highly symbolic, and we should take this very serious, of course, but we haven't seen yet a de facto trilateralism among the three countries. It nonetheless has, of course, immediate implications both for South Korea's security, national security, and also for its unification strategy, in the sense that closer coordination, even on the bilateral level between North Korea and China, between North Korea and Russia, certainly complicates South Korea's approach to unification. It strengthens North Korea's strategic value within this trilateral format. And it certainly has a detrimental effect to South Korea's national security strategy, in the sense that this close military cooperation we are just seeing and observing between North Korea and Russia, of course, has an immediate impact on South Korea's national security.
Right. So like you said, last week in China's Victory Day parade, the leaders of North Korea, China, and Russia really showcased a strong alignment, solidarity. So if this unity evolves into a sustained alliance, how do you think we should be able to respond to that?
You know, in a way, of course, South Korea should continue to foster its own trilateralism between South Korea, Japan, and the U.S. But it should also look at strengthening and diversifying its security relations beyond those two countries. And this is where Europe comes in, of course. And while Europe is not a strategic player, we've seen in the last couple of years how close also our relations on security issues like cybersecurity, economic security, and supply chains, but also we have a very close relation now in the defense sector between our countries. And all of this just goes to show how important it is that both Europe but also South Korea looks at diversifying its relations beyond Japan and the US. But these, of course, these two countries, of course, are the core for South Korea and remain the core of South Korea's national security outlook in the region.
Right. So like you said, it could be an opportunity to expand its reach, and also, further cooperate with EU nations as well. Now, following the parade last week, North Korea and China held a summit, but without any mention about North Korea's denuclearization. And that kind of raised concerns that China may now be kind of tacitly accepting North Korea's nuclear status. What do you think is how do you read into the situation?
You know, for quite a while we saw that South Korea has a different prioritization when it comes to its foreign policy objectives regarding North Korea compared to South Korea, the U.S., Japan, but also Europe. We see that China is very eager to secure regime stability, and this is the main priority of China. They don't like to see a nuclear North Korea, but they don't want to see a destabilized or an unstable North Korea. This is their first foreign policy objective when it comes to North Korea. And we see a difference here in how we prioritize our foreign policy objectives here. And this is, of course, a huge issue in this sense, in the sense that for South Korea, of course, finding a direct channel to North Korea is extremely complicated at the moment, but as we see, even for the US and also for Europe. And I think this is where we have to look very closely how China reacts now in the next couple of months. If this is truly a tactical acceptance of North Korea's nuclear status, or if it's more of a symbolic trilateralism due to the developments we saw last week.
Mm-hmm. So whether it's an acceptance or it's a means to reach to their goal, which is for North Korea's regime to be stable?
Exactly, because this is their main foreign policy priority with regard to North Korea. And this is how the Chinese often say it: we give them enough to survive, but not enough to prosper. North Korea now, of course, with its closer coordination with Russia, has a second angle to cooperation in the region. And I think this is a main reason why Kim Jong-un also went to China. It has a domestic political but also foreign policy angle to it, in the sense that North Korea aims at closer relations now again with China, which is still, even in times of closer coordination with Russia, China is still the major and main security and mainly economic partner of North Korea. Mm-hmm. And we saw that after the COVID lockdown in North Korea, these relations, especially the high-ranking, high-level diplomatic relations, cooled down. And North Korea usually tries to avoid this over-dependence on one side, which they were forced to in the last couple of years due to a lack of alternatives. Now, of course, we see a traditional North Korean playbook of using or leaning closer to one side and then try to reverse it, lean closer to the other side, and try to profit as much as they can from this.
Mm-hmm. So as for North Korea's side, it's a good opportunity for them to have both Russia and China on the table.
Yes, we have to say that North Korea arguably is in the best strategic position it has been for a very long time, in the sense that both China and Russia seek closer cooperation with North Korea now. For China, due to the U.S.-China conflict, and for Russia, of course, in the context of its war against the Ukraine, which North Korea, of course, was a very early supporter.
Mm-hmm. Now, and thanks to the support that North Korea has been receiving from Russia, it seems as though a full-scale development of an ICBM is actually underway. And just yesterday, North Korea conducted a carbon fiber solid fuel engine test for an ICBM, and Kim Jong-un himself was there. What kind of message is Pyongyang trying to portray with this?
It's in line with their foreign policy in the last couple of years. In January 2021, Kim Jong-un announced a 5-year military modernization plan. And at the heart of this modernization plan basically was the diversification of its missile systems. And we see that they focus particularly on missile systems that are faster to launch, harder to detect, and nearly, in North Korea's view, make it nearly impossible to intercept them. And of course, this is in line, in a way, with their policies of the last couple of years, which focus very much on this military modernization.
Mm-hmm. So we'll probably see more of their, such kind of efforts going on. But now let's bring in the European perspective. Ever since Russia's invasion of Ukraine and North Korea and Russia's cooperation, How has North Korea-Russia alliance actually affected EU's stance towards Pyongyang?
Well, traditionally, we have diplomatic relations. Most EU member states have diplomatic relations with North Korea. And traditionally, Europe used those diplomatic relations not as a mediator, but more as a facilitator. We saw this in Sweden very often in the past, that they were successful in bringing the major conflict parties together in Europe. Also, a lot of informal dialogue channels we had in the past, and of course, since the COVID lockdown and North Korea's policy change, all of this is on hold at the moment. I would say for Europe, due to North Korea's participation in an active war in Europe, the perception of North Korea threat for Europe multiplied. And we see that this is a true expression of the often quoted overlaps between the security dynamics in Europe and the Indo-Pacific. And this is arguably the most vivid example of this. So for Europeans, of course, having North Koreans fight in an active war in Europe changed its outlook on North Korea dramatically, in the sense that it is not only perceived now in Europe as a proliferation threat, but as a direct military threat to Europe as well. Not only in conventional security terms, but also in the sense of North Korean cyber operations in Europe, which are conducted on a regular basis. And all of these things, I think, changed the strategic thinking in Europe when it comes to North Korea, that we cannot sit idly by or sit back and wait this out. This North Korea threat is far too big for Europe too to ignore.
Right. Now, you've previously also mentioned about this, and you suggested that the EU should consider sending a special envoy to North Korea as well. But ever since the Russia-Pyongyang ties have tightened, it seems this political dialogue have come to a halt. So now, what do you think are some good steps needed to reopen diplomatic engagement between EU and North Korea?
I mean, we saw that the first European countries went back to North Korea, reopened their embassies. We saw this with Sweden, but also with Poland. So we see first steps, but these are initial steps. We are nowhere near where we have been before. In my view, I think that in the current climate, it's very difficult politically for European countries to engage directly with North Korea while North Koreans fighting in an active war in Europe against a country which is considered a partner for most of the EU member states with Ukraine. So in this climate, it's very difficult to launch a formal diplomatic initiatives, but what we can do and what we did in the past is to go to the informal level, to see if we can reopen channels of communication with North Korea, maybe first on an informal level, but of course that depends if North Korea wants to re-engage with European countries in that kind of format. Because in the past they often used these dialogue channels with Europe or also with South Korea to ultimately reach the US. Now there is a direct channel between the leaders of North Korea and the US, so it's not clear if North Korea truly wants to re-engage with Europe on this matter, but we should at least try. And I'm convinced that opening channels of communication is indispensable. Ultimately, it's very, very important to do this also, so that we can ensure that we don't have miscommunication or misreading of the other side's actions.
Right, so we really have to keep knocking the door. And as you said a while ago, Europe is really no longer detached from security issues in this Indo-Pacific region. So how do you think the EU can actually contribute to the peace-building process and stability on the Korean Peninsula?
I think that we can't play the role as of a mediator because we are not independent in this conflict. We are firmly on the side of South Korea. We saw this last year with Germany's accession to the United Nations command, and this prevents us to play an independent role in this conflict. But as I mentioned, what we can do is facilitate, maybe bring major parties of this conflict together, and we were successful in doing that in the past because we are not a major security player in this region compared to the US and other countries. But we have an interest and a stake in the Indo-Pacific, and our interest in the Indo-Pacific is not only economic. We have a security interest in the region, and so to that end, I would say that it's extremely important that we keep engaged in the region, that we increase our or even strengthen our relation with countries like South Korea and Japan, especially also on security issues.
Right. So Europe's involvement would definitely be important in the months to come. Now, let's also touch upon defense cooperation. So South Korea and Europe have been expanding defense cooperation, most notably through the K2 tank export deal with Poland. And you previously noted that Europe is set to sharply increase its defense budgets in the coming years. Do you think this kind of a growing partnership contribute to stabilize the situation in the peninsula?
Primarily, I would say our closer defense industrial relations contribute to both sides' goal of and objective of diversifying also our security relations and security partnerships. I think this is key. You know, if this stabilizes the situation on the Korean Peninsula, it's very difficult to say. But ultimately, it's for both sides, for the European countries and for South Korea, it's extremely important to strengthen these defense industrial relations because we create win-win situations. Of course, Korean companies are now a formidable competitor to European defense companies, but we are also cooperating very closely. And if you take the case of Germany, for example, German-Korean defense industrial cooperation in the past were primarily characterized by technological knowledge and parts, weapon parts that were sent from Germany to Korea. And this one-sided relationship, of course, has changed dramatically to the degree that now, of course, we have weapon systems, Korean weapon systems that are equipped with, for example, German missiles. But now, of course, we see a whole change in this relationship in the sense that South Korea now aims for localized production in Europe, what we saw in Poland already, but with the plans of, for example, companies like Hanwha Aerospace that actively seek to localized production also in East Germany. And I think to acknowledge how vast the change is in our bilateral defense industrial relations, that it can create win-win situations, and especially for us in Europe, and if we take the German case again, it will take us a couple of years to rebuild our defense base, and we don't have the means in Germany alone to build this up by our own. We need reliable partners in the defense industrial sector, and of course Korea is one of the close partners here, and I'm very positive that this defense industrial cooperation will prosper in the years to come.
Right, definitely it's a very crucial cooperation that will, also shape long-term regional deterrence.
And also one of the policy fields that is shared by both and agreed on by both the conservative and liberal parties in Korea. This is a bipartisan issue in Korea, which makes it also a long-term issue for our relationship.
Definitely. Now, speaking of Germany, Dr. Baba, you've also participated in this Korea-Germany Unification Advisory Committee discussing lessons from, Germany's unification. So what kind of, practical takeaways can Korea actually learn and draw from Germany's experience?
You know, first off, I have to say I'm very skeptical when we talk about a German model, because on the macro level, on the systemic level, the differences between the Korean case and the German case are just immense. If we only think back to the fact that there was a war fought between North and South Korea, and we never had an inter-German war, which changed the dynamic of the future relationships dramatically. Nonetheless, I would say we have some very important aspects to look at. More look at the micro level would be my suggestion. Discussing questions like what happened to the or how did the integration of the West and East German military happen? In specific, in detail, what happened to East German nurses, teachers, doctors? These, to look at these lessons, I think, could be of value. And of course, if there is anything to learn from the German case, I would say it's that unification policies must be structured long term. And I think this is a challenge for South Korea, because North Korea policy and unification policy, of course, changes dramatically when there is a change in government. And I think this is one of the things which differentiates the German case from the Korean case, because we had quite the consistency. Of course, there were differences in policies when there was a change in administration in Germany. But the broader objectives of Germany, West Germany's unification policy, were shared by all the ruling parties, governing parties in Germany. And I think this is one of the big challenges for South Korea, to structure a long-term unification policy. And a third aspect we might add, and we come back to what we already talked about, there were, from the 60s onward, even before, there were always open communication channels. It differentiated on the diplomatic level, but there was a continuous communication between East and West Germany. And this is particularly crucial when we talk about emergency communication channels, so that we can avoid maybe an unintended escalation of the military situation. To avoid things like this, it's so important to have open channels of communication. And of course, I know that this is especially challenging when we talk about North Korea. Again, big difference to East Germany. But this should be, I think, on the top of the agenda of the new South Korean administration, to open these communication channels, especially emergency communication channels, to at least decrease and lessen the likelihood of a conflict on the Korean Peninsula.
Right, very important insights, reviving inter-Korean communication, and also coming up with a really, steady, long-term plan in terms of unification.
And ultimately, of course, this is not only a political decision. This long-term unification policy in the Korean case too must be shared and accepted, of course, by the South Korean people. Mainly, it cannot be a political decision alone. It must ultimately be shared and accepted and supported by the Korean people themselves. And I think this is, if we look at the German case again, one of the crucial lessons, because ultimately German unification began not so much on the political level, but more on the level of the people, with the East German people rising up. And this was the, I would say, the major factor that ultimately contributed to German unification.
Right, a very strong note that we'll have to end on today. But thank you so much for your insights tonight, Dr. Baba.
Thank you so much for having me.
And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame tonight. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Till then, stay informed and engaged.